Hey guys, tonight we begin with medieval portraits and why nobody in them looks like they're having a good time. If you've ever wondered why every single person painted between 1000 and 1500 AD looks like they just received terrible news about their taxes, you're about to discover the truth isn't what you think. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception about medieval portraits. Most people think medieval folks were just naturally miserable, living in constant fear of plague, war, and having their teeth fall out, which, to be fair, was a legitimate concern. In reality, the reason they didn't smile had nothing to do with their mood and everything to do with what smiling meant in their world. Think of it like this. Imagine if every time you posted a selfie on social media, people assumed you were either drunk, simple-minded, or trying to seduce someone. That's essentially what a smile communicated in medieval times. This wasn't some grim, joyless society where happiness was illegal. It was a culture where your facial expression in a portrait was basically your LinkedIn profile photo, and you'd better look professional. The medieval period wasn't the dark ages Hollywood wants you to believe. It was actually a time of incredible artistic sophistication, just with very different rules about what made you look respectable. Medieval Europe wasn't some backwards wasteland where people forgot how to be happy. It was a complex society where every gesture, every piece of clothing, and yes, every facial expression carried deep social meaning. The church controlled not just spiritual life but also artistic expression, and commissioned portraits served as political statements, religious devotion, and family propaganda all rolled into one expensive package. If you thought medieval portraits were just paint what you see, think again. They were carefully choreographed performances frozen in time. A portrait wasn't a casual snapshot. It was more like a movie poster advertising your entire family's brand. The artist had to navigate the patron's ego, the church's approval, social expectations, and artistic trends, all while making sure the subject looked appropriately pious, wealthy, and powerful. Every element was symbolic, from the color of their robes to the way they held their hands. And in this world of careful symbolism, a smile was about as appropriate as showing up to a job interview in your pajamas. The wealthy merchants and nobles commissioning these portraits weren't paying hundreds of florins to look like the village fool. They wanted gravitas, dignity, and the kind of serious expression that said, I own land, I fear God, and I definitely didn't get rich by being frivolous. Meanwhile, the artists themselves were caught between wanting to create something beautiful and making sure they get paid and not excommunicated. Take the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck from 1434. You know, the one with the guy in the ridiculous hat and his possibly pregnant wife in the green dress. Giovanni Arnolfini was a successful Italian merchant living in Bruges, basically the medieval equivalent of a tech startup founder who'd just gone public. He commissioned this portrait to show off his wealth, his beautiful wife, his fancy house, and his impeccable taste in interior decorating. But look at their faces. They're not exactly radiating joy about their success. Giovanni stands there with the expression of a man who's just realized he left his cryptocurrency wallet password on a post-it note that he threw away. His wife, meanwhile, looks like she's contemplating whether marrying a merchant was worth having to pose for hours in uncomfortable clothing. But here's the twist. This wasn't capturing a moment of medieval depression. This was them looking their absolute best, according to the standards of their time. Van Eyck painted every detail with obsessive precision. The oranges on the windowsill, Basically medieval for us in terms of expense. The little dog, symbolizing loyalty, the single lit candle, representing the presence of the divine, and even the artist's signature reflected in the mirror. But despite all this wealth and symbolism screaming, we're successful and blessed. Both subjects maintain expressions that suggest they've just been told. Their accountant has some concerning news about their taxes, Dodd. And if you think that's fascinating, wait until you hear how the church's teachings about vanity and pride turned smiling into basically a minor sin that could get you a lecture from your priest. This wasn't just about looking good in a painting. Medieval portraits were investment pieces that would hang in family homes for generations, representing not just individuals, but entire bloodlines. Get your expression wrong, and you'd be remembered as either a fool or a sinner for the next 500 years. These portraits were medieval resumes, dating profiles, and political statements all in one. The church taught that excessive joy or pride were spiritually dangerous. Happiness was fine, but showing it too obviously suggested you were more focused on earthly pleasures than heavenly salvation. Meanwhile, the wealthy needed to project authority and seriousness to maintain their social position. Smile too much, and people might think you were simple. Don't look pious enough, and the church might question your devotion. Look too stern, and you might seem unapproachable for business. Artists had to navigate these complex social rules while creating something that would satisfy their patron, impress viewers, and hopefully advance their own career. One wrong brushstroke in the facial expression department could mean the difference between more commissions and having to go back to painting religious scenes for local churches. But the Arnolfini couple was just the beginning. Behind every serious medieval face was a calculated decision about social status, religious propriety, and family reputation. And the rules governing these decisions were far more complex and hilarious than you might imagine. In 1447, a portrait commission nearly triggered a diplomatic crisis between England and Burgundy that could have changed the course of European history. The trouble began when Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, commissioned a portrait of his niece, Lady Catherine de Cleves, as part of marriage negotiations with an English noble family. The artist, Jan van Eyck, painted Catherine with what he considered an appropriately noble expression, dignified, serious, and showing proper maidenly modesty. But when the portrait arrived in England, the prospective groom's family was horrified. They claimed Catherine's expression suggested melancholic temperament unsuitable for producing healthy heirs and insufficient enthusiasm for the marital state. The rejection of the portrait was interpreted by the Burgundian court as an insult not just to Catherine, but to the entire duchy. Philip the Good reportedly declared that the English had impugned the honor of our house through artistic criticism and threatened to break off not just the marriage negotiations, but all trade agreements between Burgundy and England. The crisis deepened when English ambassadors demanded a new portrait showing Catherine with a more cheerful and matrimonially optimistic expression. Van Eyck refused, claiming that painting fake emotions would compromise his artistic integrity. Catherine herself was caught in the middle. Catherine, as an idol, reportedly asking whether she should practice smiling for England or maintain dignity for Burgundy. The diplomatic standoff lasted 3 months and involved negotiations, not just about trade and marriage, but about fundamental questions of artistic representation and cultural interpretation. Finally, a compromise was reached. Van Eyck would paint a second portrait showing Catherine in a garden setting that would suggest happiness and fertility without requiring her to smile directly. The second portrait satisfied everyone except Van Eyck, who complained in his journal that he had been reduced to painting diplomatic fiction rather than artistic truth. Catherine eventually married a French duke instead, and the English family commissioned a portrait of their son looking appropriately disappointed about missing such an advantageous match. The incident became legendary in artistic circles as a notch. example of how portraits could carry unintended political consequences. It also established the principle that international marriage negotiations should include specific artistic guidelines to avoid future misunderstandings about facial expressions and their cultural meanings. Perhaps the most audacious attempt to manipulate medieval portrait conventions was undertaken by Giacomo di Santorino, a 15th century Venetian spice merchant who discovered a loophole in church artistic guidelines that allowed him to commission a portrait showing himself with an intense expression of divine rapture, typically reserved for saints and martyrs. Giacomo's scheme was brilliantly simple. Church rules prohibited secular portraits that showed excessive pride or worldly satisfaction, but they encouraged artistic depictions of spiritual ecstasy and religious devotion. Giacomo commissioned a portrait of himself, receiving divine inspiration for charitable works, which allowed him to be painted with an expression of transcendent joy while surrounded by symbols of his considerable wealth. The artist, Master Lorenzo Di Benedetto, was initially skeptical, but became fascinated by the technical challenge of painting a portrait that was simultaneously pious and self-promotional. The resulting work showed Giacomo gazing heavenward with an expression of mystical bliss, while angels supposedly inspired him to use his wealth for godly purposes. In the background, carefully arranged symbols indicated his success in the spice trade, his charitable donations, and his family's noble aspirations. The portrait was a sensation in Venice, where other wealthy merchants immediately began commissioning similar spiritual inspiration, portraits that allowed them to display both wealth and appropriate religious sentiment. The trend became so popular that church authorities eventually had to issue specific guidelines prohibiting false mystical portraits that use religious themes to circumvent restrictions on secular self-promotion. But Giacomo's masterpiece had already achieved its purpose. The portrait enhanced his social standing, attracted important business partners, and helped his family gain acceptance in Venetian noble circles. More importantly, it demonstrated how creative interpretation of artistic rules could achieve goals that direct confrontation never could. The story becomes even more entertaining when we learn that Giacomo apparently took his painted spiritual persona seriously. Contemporary accounts describe him developing increasingly elaborate charitable schemes and religious observances that seemed designed to live up to his portrait's suggestions of divine favor. His family complained that he was spending so much on charitable works inspired by his painted image that he was compromising their financial security. The portrait survived several centuries and now hangs in a Venetian museum, where tour guides explain it as an example of merchant piety without mentioning Giacomo's original scheme to game the medieval artistic system. In a final irony, the man who commissioned a fake mystical portrait to advance his worldly ambitions is now remembered primarily for his genuine, charitable works inspired by his own artistic fiction. Master Heinrich von Salzburg developed a reputation as the most passive-aggressive artist in medieval Europe. Through his subtle technique of encoding insults and criticisms into portraits while maintaining perfect technical correctness and apparent respect for his subjects, Heinrich's specialty was painting facial expressions that looked appropriately dignified at first glance but revealed unflattering character assessments upon closer examination. He would position eyebrows to suggest barely suppressed irritation, paint lip curves that hinted at condescension, or create eye expressions that conveyed the subject's lack of intelligence while maintaining the serious demeanor required by medieval conventions. His most famous revenge portrait involved Baron Friedrich von Seckendorf, who had commissioned a family portrait but then refused to pay Heinrich's full fee, claiming the work was adequate but not exceptional. Heinrich's response was to create a revised version that showed the Baron with an expression of profound smugness, while his wife appeared to be examining him with barely concealed disappointment, and their children looked like they were trying not to laugh. The technical skill was so accomplished that the family couldn't identify specific problems with the portrait, but everyone who saw it immediately understood that it was somehow unflattering. Contemporary accounts describe viewers struggling to explain why the Baron looked ridiculous, despite being painted with perfect anatomical accuracy and appropriate noble dignity. Heinrich's technique became legendary among artists who shared information about dealing with difficult patrons. He taught workshops on expressive subtlety that were ostensibly about capturing nuanced emotions, but actually focused on encoding negative judgments into portraits while maintaining plausible deniability. The Baron eventually figured out what Heinrich had done and demanded a new portrait, but Heinrich had moved to another city where his reputation for subtle character assassination made him surprisingly popular among patrons who wanted portraits of their enemies or rivals. He developed a thriving business painting, unflattering portraits of people he'd never met, working from descriptions provided by clients who wanted artistic revenge on their social or business competitors. Heinrich's career demonstrates how artistic skill could be weaponized within medieval cultural constraints, creating a form of social commentary that was both devastating and technically unassailable. His techniques influenced later satirical artists and established principles of visual irony that continue to appear in contemporary portrait photography and political caricature. Sister Marguerite de Fontaine, a Benedictine nun and accomplished artist working in 14th century France, single-handedly transformed how children were portrayed in medieval art by developing techniques that captured childhood personality while satisfying adult expectations about proper spiritual development and family dignity. The challenge Sister Marguerite faced was that medieval portrait conventions treated children essentially as small adults who should display the same serious spiritual awareness and social propriety expected from their parents. This created portraits of children who looked unnaturally solemn and psychologically disturbing rather than appropriately dignified. Sister Marguerite's innovation was to develop what she called innocent wisdom expressions that suggested spiritual awareness appropriate for children while allowing hints of natural childhood curiosity and playfulness. She achieved this through subtle techniques involving eye position, mouth curves, and overall facial composition that conveyed both childlike wonder and appropriate religious sentiment. Her breakthrough came when she painted the children of the influential de Montclair family using expressions that suggested they were contemplating God's creation with childlike awe rather than adult spiritual anxiety. The parents were delighted with portraits that made their children look both properly pious and naturally appealing, leading to commissions from wealthy families across France. Sister Marguerite's approach became particularly important for painting young girls who faced even more complex expectations about displaying appropriate feminine modesty, while showing enough personality to suggest they would become suitable wives and mothers. Her techniques for painting expressions that conveyed virtue, intelligence, and appropriate deference without making children look artificially mature influenced artistic approaches to childhood portraiture for generations. The success of her approach led to correspondence with other artists across Europe who sought her advice about painting children. Her letters, preserved in monastery archives, reveal sophisticated understanding of child psychology and artistic technique that was centuries ahead of its time. Perhaps most remarkably, Sister Marguerite's innovations occurred within the constraints of religious life and church oversight, demonstrating how creative solutions could emerge from seemingly restrictive environments. Her success as an artist enhanced rather than threatened her religious vocation, as church authorities recognized that her portraits served important functions in helping wealthy families see their children as both spiritual beings and beloved individuals. Sister Marguerite's techniques were eventually adapted for secular portraits and contributed to broader changes in how medieval society understood childhood, family relationships, and the appropriate balance between spiritual formation and natural human development. Her work represents one of the most successful examples of artistic innovation achieving social change within medieval cultural constraints. The Church's influence on medieval art wasn't just about making sure Jesus looked appropriately holy. It extended to micromanaging every facial expression that appeared in any artwork, including secular portraits. Unlike our modern assumption that art should capture authentic human emotion, medieval artistic expression was governed by a complex theological framework that viewed every smile, frown, and raised eyebrow through the lens of spiritual significance. The Church taught that your face was essentially a window to your soul's condition, and displaying the wrong emotion could indicate dangerous spiritual states. Excessive joy suggested you were too attached to worldly pleasures. Inappropriate smiling implied vanity, pride, or worse, that you might be mocking sacred things. The theological reasoning was surprisingly sophisticated. If you were truly focused on your eternal salvation and the suffering of Christ, how could you justify grinning like an idiot in a portrait that would outlast your mortal body? This wasn't just religious paranoia. It was a systematic approach to emotional regulation that made medieval society function. The Church needed people to take life seriously, to focus on prayer and penance rather than frivolous pleasure-seeking. And since portraits were expensive status symbols that would be displayed prominently in homes and public spaces, they became perfect vehicles for enforcing these spiritual standards. Church authorities could literally walk into someone's home, look at their family portrait, and use the facial expressions as evidence of the family's spiritual condition. Smile too much, and you might find yourself having an uncomfortable conversation with your local priest about the dangers of worldly attachment. Look too stern, and you might be accused of lacking proper Christian joy. The sweet spot was what theologians called holy sobriety, an expression that conveyed both spiritual seriousness and inner peace. Take the case of Robert de Lisle, a 14th century English knight who commissioned a psalter that included his portrait. The original sketches show him with what the artist described as a pleasant countenance, basically a slight smile. But when church authorities reviewed the work, they insisted the expression be changed to something more befitting a Christian warrior. The final version shows Robert looking like he's contemplating his own mortality while simultaneously planning military strategy. One contemporary wrote that Robert allegedly complained the revision made him look as though I have eaten sour grapes while contemplating the day of judgment. But the Church's reasoning was clear. A knight's portrait should inspire viewers to consider their own spiritual warfare against sin, not to think about how much fun Robert was having at medieval parties. The revised portrait was considered so successful that it became a template for other military portraits of the era. Another fascinating example involved the merchant family of Francesco Dattini in late 14th century Italy. Dattini was known for his jovial personality. Contemporary accounts describe him as someone who laughed often and brought joy to his household. But when he commissioned his family portrait, the artist was specifically instructed to paint expressions that would reflect the family's devotion to God rather than their devotion to pleasure. The resulting portrait shows Francesco and his wife looking like they've just received news that their accountant has discovered irregularities in the books, and also their priest wants to discuss their recent church attendance. Francesco's wife, Margherita, was reportedly so disappointed with her stern expression that she refused to let the portrait be displayed in the main hall, relegating it to a back room where fewer visitors would see her looking like a disapproving abbess. The irony is that we have dozens of letters between Francesco and Margherita that reveal them to be warm, affectionate, and frequently humorous people. Francesco once wrote to his wife, "I dreamed you were laughing at my attempts to look dignified, and I woke up laughing myself." But their portrait preserves them for history as the kind of serious, pious merchants the church wanted all Christian business people to emulate. Perhaps most telling is the case of the Tours Riches heirs to Duc de Berry, where the Duke of Berry appears in multiple illuminated scenes throughout the manuscript. In casual scenes depicting daily life, peasants and servants are shown with animated expressions, including smiles and laughter. But whenever the Duke himself appears, his expression maintains royal dignity and spiritual seriousness. The message was clear. Common people might be allowed emotional expression in art, but the nobility had to model proper Christian behavior even in their entertainment. The artists themselves left behind records of their frustration with these restrictions. One anonymous painter wrote in his journal, "I can paint a convincing demon with all manner of twisted expressions, but I am forbidden from painting a Christian lord with the simple pleasure of a man enjoying God's creation." Another artist noted that he had become expert at painting 17 different variations of holy resignation because clients kept asking for expressions that showed spiritual maturity without appearing either too joyful or too somber. But it wasn't that simple. The church's own art was full of contradictions that made secular portrait guidelines even more confusing. Saints were often depicted with serene, slightly smiling expressions, but these were holy smiles that indicated spiritual bliss, not earthly pleasure. Angels could be shown with joyful expressions because they weren't burdened by human sin. Even Christ himself appeared with varying expressions depending on the context, suffering during the Passion, serene in resurrection scenes, stern in judgment depictions. This created a hierarchy of acceptable expressions that confused both artists and patrons. Could a wealthy merchant look as peaceful as St. Francis? Could a noble woman show the same serene joy as the Virgin Mary? The answers depended on who was asking, which church authorities were consulted, and what the specific purpose of the portrait would be. Different regions interpreted these guidelines differently, creating a patchwork of artistic standards across medieval Europe. Italian artists, influenced by classical Roman sculptures, were more likely to include subtle emotional expression. Northern European artists, working in areas where church authority was more stringent, developed the ultra-serious expressions we most associate with medieval portraits today. The growing wealth of merchant families complicated things further. These newly rich families wanted portraits that showed their success, but they also needed to avoid appearing too worldly or prideful. The solution was often to commission portraits that included religious symbols and serious expressions, essentially creating spiritual alibis for their obvious wealth. You could surround yourself with expensive objects as long as your face suggested you weren't enjoying them too much. Even more confusing was the issue of children in portraits. Church doctrine held that children were born innocent, suggesting they should be allowed more natural expressions. But portraits were meant to show family dignity and proper Christian upbringing, which meant even children needed to look appropriately serious. The result was centuries of child portraits, showing kids who look like they've been told to contemplate their future responsibilities to the family business and their eternal soul simultaneously. The result was an artistic culture where technical skill flourished while emotional authenticity was systematically suppressed. Medieval artists became incredibly sophisticated at painting textures, fabrics, architectural details, and symbolic objects. But human facial expressions remained locked in a narrow range of church-approved emotions. This had profound effects on how families saw themselves and wanted to be remembered. Portrait sessions became exercises in spiritual performance rather than attempts to capture personality. Children grew up seeing their parents' portraits and learning that public dignity required emotional restraint. The wealthy developed what we might call portrait face, a practiced expression of serious respectability that they could summon whenever formal representation was required. The artistic consequences were equally significant. Painters developed incredible technical skills in every area, except the one that might have made their subjects most relatable to future viewers. We can see every thread in a medieval noble's clothing, every wrinkle in their skin, every reflection in their jewelry, but we can't see their personality. Some families rebelled in subtle ways. They commissioned portraits with symbolic elements that hinted at their real personalities. Musical instruments for those who loved music, books for intellectuals, flowers for those who enjoyed beauty. These became coded ways of showing humanity within the constraints of spiritual propriety. The Church's success in controlling artistic expression also created an unexpected consequence. When Renaissance artists finally began showing more natural emotions, the contrast was revolutionary. Early Renaissance smiles look almost shockingly human compared to their medieval predecessors, precisely because viewers had been trained to see emotional restraint as normal and appropriate. Professional artists began developing specializations based on these restrictions. Some became experts at painting spiritual authority for church officials. Others mastered noble dignity for aristocratic clients. And still others specialized in merchant respectability for the growing business class. These became recognized categories with specific techniques and approaches. The economic impact was also significant. Families spent enormous sums on portraits that would represent them properly. An artist could command higher fees for getting the spiritual tone exactly right. A portrait that successfully balanced wealth display with appropriate piety became a valuable family asset that could enhance social standing for generations. Meanwhile, a different set of pressures was emerging from the secular world of politics and social climbing. If the Church controlled how people should look spiritually appropriate, the complex world of medieval social hierarchy was developing its own rules about how different classes should present themselves in portraits. Noble families weren't just worried about looking pious. They needed to look noble in ways that distinguished them from wealthy merchants, who might be richer but weren't born to rule. Merchants needed to look successful enough to attract business partners, but not so successful that they threatened established noble families. And everyone needed to navigate the dangerous waters of royal court politics, where the wrong expression in a portrait could be interpreted as disloyalty, ambition, or insufficiently respectful deference to the crown. These secular pressures would create an entirely new set of artistic challenges, as painters found themselves not just managing religious propriety, but also encoding complex political messages into every facial expression. The result was a system where your face in a portrait had to simultaneously satisfy God, the Church, your social superiors, your business associates, and your family's reputation, all while making sure you didn't accidentally smile too much and ruin everything. If the Church's influence on medieval portraits was like having a strict teacher monitoring your behavior, then the secular world of social hierarchy was like playing a deadly game of chess where every facial expression was a move that could either advance your position or get you eliminated from the board entirely. The complex web of medieval social climbing made religious propriety look simple by comparison. Unlike the Church's relatively straightforward rules about spiritual appropriate expressions, secular society demanded that your portrait face communicate your exact position in an incredibly complex social hierarchy, while simultaneously showing proper deference to those above you and appropriate authority over those below you. A noble couldn't just look noble. They had to look like the right kind of noble, at the right level of nobility, with the right attitude toward their specific place in the feudal system. This became especially complicated as medieval society grew more sophisticated and new classes emerged. The rise of wealthy merchants created a whole new category of people who were rich enough to commission portraits but hadn't been born into the traditional nobility. These nouveau rich families faced a delicate balancing act. They needed to look successful enough to be taken seriously in business, but not so presumptuous that they appeared to be challenging the established social order. Meanwhile, the traditional nobility found themselves having to distinguish their portraits from those of wealthy merchants, leading to an arms race of increasingly subtle social signals encoded in facial expressions. A slight tilt of the chin could indicate royal blood versus mere baronial status. The angle of the eyes could suggest whether someone was a court insider or a provincial lord hoping for advancement. The result was a portrait culture where every facial muscle carried political meaning, and getting your expression wrong could have consequences that extended far beyond artistic criticism. Your portrait face became a diplomatic document, a social resume, and a political statement all in one carefully calculated expression. Consider the fascinating case of Jacques Coeur, the 15th century French merchant who became so wealthy that he effectively financed the French crown's military campaigns. Coeur's portrait, painted around 1450, shows him with what art historians call merchant dignity, an expression that manages to convey prosperity, reliability, and business acumen, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that he considers himself equal to the nobles he's funding. The portrait session itself was reportedly a comedy of errors. Coeur's first attempt at a noble expression was rejected by his artistic advisor, who pointed out that he looked like he was contemplating the purchase of a kingdom. His second attempt, described as humble merchant, was deemed too subservient for someone of his actual influence. The final expression took weeks to perfect, a look that contemporary observers described as wealthy but not presumptuous, confident but not arrogant, successful but appropriately grateful for divine favor. What makes Coeur's story particularly amusing is that we have records of his actual personality from business correspondence and court documents. He was apparently witty, charming, and had what one associate called a laugh that could fill a cathedral. But his portrait preserves him as the epitome of serious merchant respectability, an expression so perfectly calibrated that it became a template for other merchant portraits of the era. Even more complex was the situation faced by Isabella of Portugal when she married Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, in 1429. As a Portuguese princess marrying into the Burgundian court, her portrait had to navigate multiple layers of diplomatic messaging. She needed to look appropriately royal for her birth status, but not so regal that she overshadowed her husband. She had to appear Portuguese enough to honor her homeland, but Burgundian enough to show her new loyalty. The surviving portraits show Isabella with what can only be described as diplomatic face, an expression so carefully neutral that it could be interpreted as either modest Portuguese nobility or appropriately deferential Burgundian duchess, depending on the viewer's perspective. Contemporary accounts suggest the portrait sessions were exhausting, with Isabella practicing different expressions for hours, while advisors debated the political implications of each eyebrow position. The most dramatic example of portrait politics gone wrong involves the English noble Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, whose 1483 portrait may have contributed to his eventual execution. Stafford commissioned a portrait that showed him with what he considered ducal authority, a stern, commanding expression that emphasized his importance in the realm. Unfortunately, the portrait was completed just as Stafford was beginning to plot against Richard III. When the portrait was displayed at court, observers noted that Stafford's expression seemed to suggest someone who was contemplating matters above his station. The portrait became evidence in the treason case against him, with prosecutors arguing that his facial expression demonstrated prideful ambition inappropriate to a subject of the crown. Whether this was a genuine factor in his downfall or merely convenient evidence is debatable. But Stafford's portrait certainly didn't help his case when he was accused of thinking himself worthy of royal power. Perhaps the most successful navigation of portrait politics was achieved by the Medici family. In Florence, Cosimo de' Medici's portrait, painted around 1460, shows him with an expression that art historians call Republican dignity. He looks wealthy and important, but not monarchical. The expression suggests someone who is first among equals, rather than a ruler, which was exactly the political message the Medici needed to send in the Florentine Republic. The genius of Cosimo's portrait face was its adaptability. Florentine Republicans could look at it and see appropriate civic virtue. Visiting nobles could interpret it as suitable deference to their superior birth. Church officials could read it as proper humility before God. Business associates could see it as trustworthy merchant reliability. It was a masterpiece of political facial expression that helped the Medici maintain power for generations. This wasn't isolated to a few high-profile cases. Across medieval Europe, portrait expressions were developing into a sophisticated system of social communication that everyone understood, but nobody explicitly acknowledged. The pattern was remarkably consistent. The higher your social position, the more restrained your expression had to be, because excessive emotion was seen as a loss of noble self-control. Kings and emperors developed what we might call divine right face, expressions so serene and authoritative that they suggested direct connection to heavenly power. High nobles cultivated feudal dignity, stern expressions that indicated their right to command others while showing appropriate deference to royal authority. Lesser nobles perfected provincial pride, expressions that suggested importance within their local sphere without claiming broader significance. The merchant classes created their own hierarchy of expressions. Successful international traders developed cosmopolitan confidence, expressions that suggested worldly experience and financial reliability. Local merchants aimed for civic respectability, faces that indicated prosperity and community standing. Craftsmen and guild members portrayed skilled dignity, expressions that showed pride in their work without suggesting they were above their station. This pattern existed because medieval society was obsessed with maintaining social stability through clearly defined hierarchies. Everyone needed to know exactly where they stood in relation to everyone else, and portrait expressions became a visual language for communicating these relationships. Your face had to tell viewers not just who you were, but where you belonged in the social structure. The system was so sophisticated that people could look at a portrait and immediately assess the subject's social position, political affiliations, and appropriate level of deference they should show. It was like having your entire social resume written on your face, which meant getting it wrong could be socially devastating. Regional variations added another layer of complexity. Italian city-states developed different expression standards than French courts, which differed from German imperial territories, which had their own variations from English noble traditions. A portrait expression that worked perfectly in Florence might be completely inappropriate in Paris, creating challenges for nobles who needed to operate in multiple political environments. The effects of this elaborate system of portrait politics were both profound and ridiculous. On one hand, it created a sophisticated visual language that helped maintain social order and political stability. People knew their place, understood their roles, and could navigate complex social interactions with the help of clearly defined expression codes. Medieval society benefited from this system because it reduced social friction. When everyone's portrait communicated their exact social position, there were fewer awkward moments of people not knowing how to treat each other. The merchant who saw a noble's portrait knew immediately what level of deference was expected. The noble who visited a merchant's home could assess the merchant's social pretensions and respond accordingly. But the system also created enormous pressure and psychological stress. Commissioning a portrait became an exercise in social anxiety, with families spending months debating the political implications of every facial expression. Artists developed specializations in different types of social expressions, and portrait sessions became elaborate consultations involving not just the artist, but also political advisors. social climbing consultants, and sometimes even diplomats. The unintended consequences were equally significant. The constant need to maintain appropriate expressions in portraits spilled over into daily life, creating a culture where emotional restraint became a mark of social sophistication. Medieval nobles developed what we might call portrait face syndrome, the habit of maintaining artificially controlled expressions, even in private settings. This system also created opportunities for social manipulation and political maneuvering. Skilled politicians could use portrait expressions to send subtle messages about their loyalties, ambitions, and allegiances. Rival families could engage in expression warfare, commissioning portraits that subtly challenged their enemies' social positions or suggested their own superior claims to status. The economic impact was substantial. Wealthy families spent enormous sums not just on the portraits themselves, but on the consultation process needed to get their expressions politically correct. A whole industry developed around portrait coaching, with specialists who could advise clients on the appropriate facial expressions for their social situation. Perhaps most importantly, this system created a visual record of medieval social anxiety that we can still read today. When we look at medieval portraits and see those carefully controlled, emotionally restrained expressions, we're seeing the faces of people who were constantly aware of their social position and terrified of expressing the wrong thing through their facial expressions. Yet even as nobles and merchants were perfecting these elaborate systems of social expression, a completely different kind of drama was unfolding in the actual portrait studios. The relationship between artists and their powerful patrons was creating its own set of tensions, comedies, and occasional disasters that would make modern celebrity photography sessions look like peaceful meditation retreats. Artists found themselves caught between their artistic vision and their need to satisfy clients who had very specific ideas about how they wanted to be portrayed. The wealthy and powerful weren't just commissioning art. They were hiring image consultants, spin doctors, and brand managers all rolled into one paint-covered package. And when your client has the power to have you imprisoned, excommunicated, or worse, the pressure to get their portrait expression exactly right became a matter of professional survival. The stories emerging from these high stakes portrait sessions reveal a world where artistic temperament clashed with political necessity, where creative vision battled social expectation, and where getting someone's facial expression wrong could ruin both your career and your client's reputation. The medieval art world was about to become a battlefield of egos, expectations, and very expensive mistakes stopped by the late 14th century. The business of medieval portrait painting had reached a breaking point where artistic egos, political necessity, and social climbing collided in spectacular fashion. The stakes had never been higher. Wealthy patrons were spending fortunes on portraits that could make or break their social standing, while artists found themselves walking tightropes between creative integrity and the very real threat of powerful clients who could destroy their careers, their reputations, and occasionally their lives. The tension centered around a fundamental conflict that medieval society had never quite resolved. Who was really in charge of how someone looked in their portrait? The patron, who was paying enormous sums and whose social future depended on getting it right? The artist, who understood technique, composition, and how to make people look their best? Or the various advisors, church officials, and political consultants who all had opinions about what expressions were appropriate for different social situations? This wasn't just about artistic differences. It was about power, money, and survival. In a world where your reputation could be destroyed by a single poorly chosen facial expression, artists were being asked to perform miracles, make someone look noble without appearing presumptuous, wealthy without seeming greedy, pious without looking boring, and politically loyal while maintaining enough dignity to command respect. The breaking point came when several high-profile portrait disasters created scandals that rocked the medieval art world. Suddenly, everyone realized that the polite fiction of collaborative artistic creation was masking a system where, too many people had too much power over outcomes that affected everyone's future. The result was a series of portrait crises that would fundamentally change how medieval art was created and who controlled the creative process. The most spectacular portrait disaster of the medieval period involved the English noble Thomas de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, and the Flemish master painter Johannes van der Meer in 1398. What should have been a straightforward commission to paint the Earl's family portrait became a months-long battle of wills that ended with lawsuits, death threats, and one of the most hilariously inappropriate portraits in medieval art history. The trouble began when that day, Beauchamp commissioned van der Meer to paint a family portrait that would demonstrate the Earl's loyalty to the newly crowned Henry IV, while also asserting his family's ancient noble lineage. Simple enough, except that everyone involved had different ideas about how to achieve these goals. Van der Meer's initial sketches showed the Earl with what the artist considered noble dignity, a stern, authoritative expression that emphasized his aristocratic bearing. But de Beauchamp's political advisor, a man named Sir William Bigod, insisted the expression was too Ricardian, meaning it looked like the kind of noble arrogance associated with supporters of the recently deposed Richard II. He demanded the expression be softened to show more Henrician humility. The Earl's wife, meanwhile, hated her own expression in the sketches, complaining that Van der Meer had made her look like a nun contemplating a particularly boring sermon. She wanted to look more regal, more beautiful, and less like someone who has taken a vow of perpetual disappointment. The couple's teenage son was portrayed with the serious expression appropriate for a young noble, but he kept making faces during the painting sessions because he thought the whole process was ridiculous. Van der Meer, who had painted nobility across Europe and considered himself the leading portrait expert of his generation, became increasingly frustrated with the constant demands for revisions. His letters to a fellow artist reveal his growing exasperation. "I am asked to paint expressions that do not exist in nature. How does one look humble yet noble, wealthy yet modest, loyal yet independent? They want me to paint impossibilities." The crisis peaked when Sir William Bigod brought in a facial expression consultant, essentially a medieval spin doctor who specialized in helping nobles manage their public image. This consultant, Master Geoffrey de Clare, had studied at the University of Paris and claimed expertise in the philosophical principles governing appropriate countenance for Christian nobility. De Clare examined Van der Meer's work and declared that the entire approach was wrong. The Earl's expression showed insufficient gratitude for divine favor. The Countess looked pridefully aware of her own beauty, and their son's face suggested youthful impetuosity inappropriate for a future Earl. He prescribed a complete overhaul of all facial expressions, based on what he called the theological geometry of proper noble countenance. Van der Meer exploded. According to eyewitness accounts, he told de Clare that his theological geometry was pretentious nonsense invented by someone who has never held a paintbrush, and that he would rather paint portraits of demons in hell than continue working with philosophical frauds who think they understand art better than artists. The Earl, caught between his expensive artist and his political advisor, tried to mediate by suggesting they paint multiple versions and choose the best one. This led to Van der Meer's famous response: "My lord, I am a master painter, not a merchant selling different varieties of herring at market. Art is not created by committee, and nobility is not painted by consensus." Things deteriorated rapidly from there. De Clare accused Van der Meer of being artistically arrogant and spiritually dangerous. Van der Meer responded by painting a revised portrait that was technically perfect but subtly insulting. The Earl's expression suggested someone who was trying very hard to look intelligent. The Countess appeared to be smelling something unpleasant, and their son looked like he was suppressing laughter at his parents' expense. When the family saw the results, the Countess reportedly screamed that Van der Meer had painted us as fools, trying to appear noble, while the Earl declared that the artist had committed visual treason against our family honor. The son, however, burst into laughter and said it was the most accurate portrait he'd ever seen, which did not improve the situation. The final confrontation occurred when de Kant Wendy Kumud. Claire demanded that Van der Meer repaint the entire family with expressions based on classical Romance sculptures he had studied. Van der Meer's response was to pack up his materials, tell the Earl that he would rather starve in a ditch than compromise his artistic integrity for the satisfaction of philosophical pretenders, and storm out of the castle, leaving behind a half-finished portrait that perfectly captured the family's growing frustration with the entire process. The response to the Van der Meer disaster was swift and dramatic. Word of the confrontation spread throughout the English court and across the European art world, creating the medieval equivalent of a celebrity scandal. Everyone had opinions about who was right, who was wrong, and what the incident revealed about the state of medieval art. Patronage. The Earl of Warwick's reaction was predictably furious. He sued Van der Meer for breach of contract, claiming the artist had willfully destroyed our family honor through malicious artistic sabotage. He demanded not only the return of his advance payment, but also compensation for the damage to our reputation caused by this artistic catastrophe. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, with testimony from other nobles about appropriate portrait standards and expert witnesses debating the technical quality of Van der Meer's work. The art community split into factions over the incident. Some artists supported Van der Meer's stance, arguing that artistic integrity required resistance to impossible client demands. Others worried that his confrontational approach would make all artists look unreliable and difficult to work with. A group of Flemish painters wrote a letter defending Van der Meer's technical skills while diplomatically suggesting that better communication might have prevented this unfortunate situation. Church authorities used the incident to reinforce their position that secular portraits were inherently problematic because they encouraged vanity and pride. Several bishops pointed to the Van der Meer affair as evidence that wealthy families were becoming dangerously obsessed with their earthly image rather than their spiritual development. One archbishop declared that when painters and patrons engage in public warfare over facial expressions, it reveals the spiritual emptiness of both parties. The political implications were equally significant. Other nobles began to worry that commissioning portraits might expose them to similar scandals. Some families canceled planned portrait commissions entirely, while others hired multiple advisors to ensure their portraits wouldn't create political or social problems. The incident contributed to a general atmosphere of anxiety about artistic representation that affected the entire medieval art market. Van der Meer himself became both notorious and celebrated, depending on who was talking about him. Some wealthy patrons refused to work with him, considering him too difficult and unpredictable. But others sought him out specifically because they wanted an artist who wouldn't be intimidated by political pressures. His reputation as someone who painted truthful portraits rather than flattering lies actually enhanced his career in some circles. The Earl's family eventually commissioned a replacement portrait from a more compliant artist, but the damage to their reputation was already done. Court gossips referred to them as the family that couldn't get painted, and their social standing suffered from the public spectacle of their artistic failure. The incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to micromanage artistic creation. Perhaps most importantly, the Van der Meer affair exposed the fundamental contradictions in medieval portrait culture. Everyone wanted authentic-looking art, But they also wanted their portraits to serve political, social, and spiritual purposes that often conflicted with authentic representation. The incident forced the medieval art world to confront the question of whether it was possible to create meaningful art within such restrictive parameters. This portrait catastrophe wasn't just entertainment for medieval gossips. It revealed deep structural problems in how medieval society approached artistic representation. The Van der Meer incident exposed the fact that portrait painting had become an impossible balancing act, where too many powerful interests were trying to control outcomes that affected everyone's reputation and livelihood. The disaster showed that the medieval portrait system had created a situation where artists were expected to be simultaneously creative visionaries, political consultants, spiritual advisors, and diplomatic mediators. They were supposed to understand not just painting techniques, but also theology, politics, social hierarchy, and family psychology. The fact that most artists weren't trained for these additional responsibilities meant that conflicts were inevitable. What the incident revealed about medieval society was equally troubling. The wealthy and powerful had become so obsessed with controlling their public image that they were willing to engage in expensive, time-consuming battles over subtle differences in facial expressions. The system had created a culture where appearance mattered more than reality, where perception was more important than truth. The Van der Meer affair also demonstrated how medieval society's complex systems of authority created paralysis rather than excellence. When church officials, political advisors, social consultants, and family members all had veto power over artistic decisions, the result was often creative gridlock rather than inspired art. 2. Many cooks weren't just spoiling the broth. They were having philosophical arguments about the spiritual significance of soup while the kitchen burned down around them. Perhaps most significantly, the incident foreshadowed the coming changes in Renaissance art, where artists would gradually gain more control over their creative process and patrons would learn to trust artistic expertise rather than trying to micromanage every brushstroke. The medieval system of committee-controlled art was proving unsustainable, and the Van der Meer disaster was just the most dramatic example of its fundamental contradictions. The broader lesson was that authentic artistic expression and excessive social control were incompatible, a realization that would eventually transform how European art was created, and who controlled the creative process. Around the main drama of medieval portrait painting, a fascinating cast of supporting characters emerged who made the whole system even more entertaining and absurd. These weren't the famous artists or wealthy patrons whose names survived in history books. They were the consultants, critics of failed painters and professional meddlers who turned medieval art into a circus of competing egos and ridiculous expertise. First, meet Master Geoffrey de Clare, the facial expression consultant we encountered in the Van der Meer disaster. Geoffrey had built an entire career around what he called physiognomical theology, essentially the belief that God had designed human facial expressions to communicate spiritual states, and that proper Christians could learn to read these divine messages. He traveled from court to court, offering his services to families who wanted to ensure their portraits conveyed appropriate religious and social messages. Geoffrey's specialty was creating what he termed expression charts, detailed diagrams, showing exactly how different facial muscles should be positioned to communicate various combinations of piety, nobility, wealth, and political loyalty. He claimed to have studied over 300 holy faces in religious art to develop his system and charged enormous fees for consultations that could last weeks. His clients included some of the most powerful families in Europe, though many artists considered him a pretentious fraud who had never actually painted anything in his life. Then there's Brother Benedict of Cluny, a Benedictine monk who appointed himself the unofficial critic of secular portrait art. Benedict believed that any portrait showing insufficient Spiritual seriousness was actively harmful to viewers' souls, and he made it his mission to identify and condemn what he called spiritually dangerous art. He would travel to view newly completed portraits and write detailed critiques explaining exactly how each facial expression violated proper Christian principles. Benedict's reviews were legendary for their combination of theological sophistication and petty nitpicking. He once wrote a 15-page analysis of why a merchant's slightly raised eyebrow indicated prideful presumption incompatible with Christian humility, and another time declared that a noblewoman's portrait showed excessive awareness of her own beauty, suggesting vanity that imperils her eternal soul. His critiques were widely read and could seriously damage both artists' and patrons' reputations, making him one of the most feared figures in medieval art circles. Perhaps most entertaining was Marguerite Margaret the Painter, one of the few female artists working in secular portraits during the late medieval period. Marguerite specialized in painting women and children, partly because male artists often struggled with the complex social expectations for female expressions. In portraits, she developed a reputation for being able to make any woman look simultaneously beautiful, virtuous, and appropriately modest, a combination that male artists found nearly impossible to achieve. Marguerite's success came from her understanding that women's portrait expressions had to navigate even more complex social expectations than men's. A woman had to look beautiful enough to reflect well on her family, but not so beautiful that she appeared vain. She needed to seem virtuous and modest, but not so withdrawn that she looked antisocial. She had to appear intelligent enough to be a good wife and mother, but not so clever that she seemed threatening to male authority. What made Marguerite particularly valuable was her ability to encode these contradictory requirements into subtle facial expressions that satisfied everyone involved. She developed techniques for painting eyes that looked both demure and intelligent, mouth positions that suggested both virtue and warmth, and overall expressions that managed to be simultaneously humble and confident. Her waiting list included some of the most prominent women in medieval Europe, and her fees were comparable to those charged by the most famous male artists of her era. These weren't isolated incidents. The medieval portrait world was a surprisingly small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, leading to webs of relationships, rivalries, and collaborations that created ongoing soap opera-level drama. The connection between Geoffrey de Clare and Brother Benedict illustrates how these personalities influenced each other. Geoffrey's expression charts were actually developed partly in response to Benedict's criticisms of portrait art. When Benedict declared that most secular portraits showed insufficient spiritual awareness, Geoffrey saw a business opportunity and created his consulting service to help families avoid Benedict's condemnation. The two men never met, but their careers were essentially built around responding to each other's work. This created a feedback loop where Benedict's increasingly detailed critiques led to Geoffrey's ever more elaborate expression requirements, which led to artists struggling to satisfy impossible standards, which led to more portrait disasters like the Van der Meer affair. The whole system became a self-perpetuating cycle of anxiety and overcomplication that made everyone involved more stressed and less satisfied with the results. Marguerite Painter's career intersected with both men's work in fascinating ways. She had to navigate Geoffrey's expression charts when painting women from families that hired him as a consultant, but she also had to consider Benedict's theological requirements when her portraits would be displayed in religiously conservative households. Her solution was to develop a coding system where women's expressions could be read multiple ways, depending on the viewer's perspective and priorities. The political networks were equally complex. Artists, patrons, and consultants all moved in, overlapping circles where reputation and word-of-mouth recommendations determined who got work and who got blacklisted. A single bad experience could destroy careers, while a successful collaboration could lead to years of profitable commissions. For example, when the Earl of Warwick's portrait disaster with Van der Meer became public, it created opportunities for other artists who positioned themselves as more collaborative and easier to work with. Several painters built successful careers by explicitly marketing themselves as the anti-Van der Meer artists who would work with clients rather than against them. But the interconnected nature of the medieval art world also meant that scandals could spread quickly and affect multiple careers simultaneously. When one prominent family had a portrait disaster, it often led other wealthy patrons to question their own artist's work, creating waves of anxiety and renegotiation that rippled through the entire industry. The social networks also created opportunities for artistic collaboration and mutual support. Marguerite La Painter often worked with male artists on family portraits, handling the female figures while her male colleagues painted the men. These collaborations required careful coordination not just of artistic techniques, but also of the social and theological requirements each figure needed to meet. Perhaps most interestingly, the medieval portrait world developed its own internal gossip network that functioned like a primitive version of industry trade publications. Artists, consultants, and patrons all shared information about who was difficult to work with, which families had impossible standards, and which consultants were worth their fees. This informal communication system helped prevent some disasters, while occasionally creating new ones when gossip was inaccurate or malicious. To understand these characters and their relationships, you have to understand the bizarre cultural moment that created them. Medieval society in the 14th and 15th centuries was experiencing unprecedented wealth among merchant and noble classes, combined with growing anxiety about social status and spiritual salvation. This created a perfect storm of conditions that made portrait painting both incredibly important and incredibly stressful. Daily life for wealthy medieval families was increasingly focused on managing their public image. Unlike earlier medieval periods where social roles were more fixed and obvious, the later medieval period saw more social mobility, which meant more competition for status and more anxiety about maintaining position. Portraits became weapons in this social competition, but they were also potential liabilities if they conveyed the wrong messages. The cultural beliefs surrounding facial expressions were surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval people genuinely believed that your habitual facial expressions shaped your character, and that your character was visible in your face. This wasn't just superstition. It was based on classical philosophical traditions that connected physical appearance to moral and spiritual states. When someone commissioned a portrait, they weren't just choosing how to look. They were choosing who to be. Social structures meant that portraits served multiple functions simultaneously. They were family documents that would be passed down through generations, political statements that communicated loyalty and status, religious artifacts that needed to demonstrate proper spiritual attitudes, and business tools that could enhance or damage professional relationships. Getting any of these functions wrong could have serious long-term consequences. What was normal versus exceptional in this world would seem bizarre to modern viewers. It was completely normal for portrait sessions to involve multiple consultants, weeks of planning, and extensive negotiations about every detail of expression and pose. It was expected that wealthy families would spend as much on portrait consultations as on the actual painting. It was routine for religious authorities to review and comment on secular portraits, and for political advisors to have input on artistic decisions. What was exceptional was finding artists, patrons, and consultants who could navigate this complex system without major conflicts or disasters. The Van der Meer affair was dramatic. But smaller versions of similar conflicts happened regularly throughout the medieval art world. Perhaps most ironic was that a culture obsessed with authentic spiritual expression created an artistic system that made authentic expression nearly impossible. Medieval society valued sincerity and genuine faith, but their portrait requirements forced people to adopt artificial expressions that satisfied social and theological requirements rather than reflecting their actual personalities or emotions. The contradiction between wealth display and spiritual humility created particularly amusing situations. Wealthy families wanted portraits that showed their success and status, but they also needed to appear appropriately modest and focused on spiritual rather than material concerns. The result was portraits showing people surrounded by obvious signs of wealth while wearing expressions that suggested they barely noticed their expensive clothes, jewelry, and furnishings. Even more contradictory was the relationship between individual personality and social conformity. Medieval culture celebrated individual achievement and unique talents. The portrait requirements demanded that everyone within a social class adopt nearly identical expressions and poses. The most successful people were often the most interesting and distinctive personalities, but their portraits made them look like interchangeable representatives of their social categories. The gender contradictions were particularly striking. Medieval society had complex and often contradictory expectations for women, who were supposed to be simultaneously beautiful and modest, intelligent and deferential, strong enough to manage households, but gentle enough to seem feminine. Women's portraits had to encode all these contradictions into single facial expressions, leading to the strange phenomenon of medieval women's portraits that look like they're trying to solve complex mathematical problems while appearing serene. And content. Perhaps the ultimate irony was that this elaborate system designed to ensure appropriate and dignified artistic representation often produced results that looked forced, artificial, and slightly ridiculous to later viewers. The very efforts to control and perfect portrait expressions often made them look less natural and appealing than more spontaneous artistic approaches might have achieved. Everything changed when Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile around 1503. But the real revolution had been building for decades before Elisa Gherardini ever sat for her portrait. The turning point wasn't a single moment, but rather a gradual rebellion against the medieval system that had made portrait painting into an exercise in social anxiety and theological compliance rather than artistic expression. The shift began in the Italian city-states, where merchants had grown wealthy enough to challenge traditional noble authority and where classical Roman and Greek art was being rediscovered and celebrated. These newly powerful families wanted portraits that reflected their confidence, success, and sophisticated tastes, rather than their ability to look appropriately humble and spiritually concerned. They began commissioning artists who could paint them as they wanted to see themselves, rather than as medieval society thought they should appear. The key factor that made this transformation possible was the changing relationship between artists and patrons. Renaissance artists were beginning to see themselves as intellectuals and creative professionals rather than craftsmen who followed instructions. They studied anatomy, perspective, and classical artistic principles, giving them technical knowledge that their medieval predecessors often lacked. This expertise gave them leverage in negotiations with patrons and confidence to resist impossible demands about facial expressions. Economic changes also drove the transformation. The Italian city-states had developed economies based on trade, banking, and manufacturing rather than feudal agriculture, creating new sources of wealth and power that operated outside traditional noble hierarchies. These new wealthy families didn't need to worry as much about fitting into established social categories because they were creating their own rules for success and respectability. Perhaps most importantly, Renaissance humanist philosophy was challenging. medieval assumptions about the relationship between earthly life and spiritual salvation. Humanists argued that enjoying worldly success and beauty wasn't necessarily incompatible with Christian faith, and that human achievement and happiness deserved celebration rather than suppression. This intellectual shift provided philosophical justification for portrait expressions that showed confidence, pleasure, and even joy. The Church's authority was also being questioned in ways that would have been unthinkable during the height of medieval power. While religious faith remained important, secular authorities and individual conscience were gaining recognition as legitimate sources of moral guidance. This meant that church approval was no longer the only consideration when commissioning art, giving both artists and patrons more freedom to experiment with expressions that might not meet strict theological requirements. The transition from medieval to Renaissance portrait styles didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process marked by experimentation, resistance, and occasional spectacular failures as artists and patrons tried to navigate between old expectations and new possibilities. The first signs of change appeared in Flemish painting during the early 15th century, where artists like Jan van Eyck began incorporating subtle emotional expressions that went beyond the standard medieval repertoire. Van Eyck's subjects still maintained appropriate dignity, but their faces showed hints of personality, intelligence, and even gentle humor that medieval portraits had avoided. The Arnolfini portrait, despite its subject's serious expressions, included details and symbolic elements that suggested the couple's enjoyment of their prosperity and domestic happiness. Resistance to these changes came from predictable sources. Church authorities worried that more expressive portraits would encourage vanity and worldly attachment. Conservative nobles feared that relaxing expression standards would undermine social hierarchy by making everyone look equally confident and worthy of respect. Professional consultants like Geoffrey de Clare found their services becoming less essential as artists gained confidence in their own judgment about appropriate expressions. The breakthrough moment came when several prominent Italian families began commissioning portraits that deliberately challenged medieval conventions. The Medici family in Florence led this movement, commissioning portraits that showed them as confident, successful, and intellectually sophisticated rather than humbly deferential to traditional authority. Cosimo de' Medici's later portraits show him with expressions that suggest someone who knows his own worth and isn't afraid to display it. Champions of change emerged among both artists and patrons, who saw the new style as more honest and compelling than medieval alternatives. Artists argued that they could create more beautiful and meaningful art when freed from artificial constraints about facial expressions. Patrons discovered that Renaissance-style portraits were more effective at projecting power and success than medieval portraits that made everyone look worried about their spiritual condition. The specific steps of transformation varied by region and social class. In Italian city-states, the change happened relatively quickly because merchant families had both the wealth and the independence to ignore traditional authorities. In Northern Europe, where church and noble authority remained stronger, the transition was more gradual and subtle. French and English noble families began experimenting with slightly more relaxed expressions while maintaining enough traditional elements to avoid scandal. Obstacles were significant and sometimes dangerous. Artists who pushed too far too fast could find themselves accused of promoting inappropriate values or challenging social order. Some patrons who commissioned overly innovative portraits faced criticism from peers who saw the new styles as evidence of spiritual corruption or social climbing. The medieval establishment fought back by commissioning traditional style portraits that emphasized the continued relevance of old values and approaches. Breakthrough moments occurred when high-profile successes demonstrated the effectiveness of Renaissance approaches. When Lorenzo de' Medici's portrait showed him as both powerful and intellectually sophisticated, while also maintaining appropriate dignity. Other wealthy families began requesting similar treatments. The success of Flemish artists in northern European courts proved that more expressive portraits could enhance rather than damage patrons' reputations. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces created interesting tensions throughout this transition. Individual artists like Leonardo da Vinci and individual patrons like Lorenzo de' Medici played crucial roles in advancing the new style, but they were also responding to broader changes in European society, economy, and intellectual life. The Renaissance portrait revolution was both driven by creative visionaries and made possible by historical circumstances that gave those visionaries the opportunity and support they needed to succeed. Perhaps most fascinating was how the transition created a generation of artists who had to master both medieval and Renaissance approaches depending on their clients' preferences and comfort levels. Marguerite Lapeinture, for example, developed techniques for painting women with expressions that could be read as either traditional medieval modesty or Renaissance confidence, depending on the viewer's expectations. This adaptability allowed artists to serve both conservative and progressive clients while gradually shifting the overall market toward more expressive styles. The economic dynamics of change were equally complex. Renaissance-style portraits initially commanded higher prices because they required more skilled artists and more sophisticated techniques. But as the style became more popular and more artists mastered the approaches, traditional medieval portraits began to look outdated and cheap by comparison. This market pressure accelerated the transition as patrons realized that old-style portraits might actually damage their reputations by making them appear backward or provincial. The new Renaissance portrait system was grammatically different from its medieval predecessor, but it created its own set of opportunities and challenges that artists and patrons had to navigate. Instead of following rigid rules about appropriate expressions, Renaissance portraits celebrated individual personality, emotional complexity, and psychological depth in ways that would have scandalized medieval authorities. The most obvious change was the emergence of what we might call confident faces, expressions that showed self-assurance, intelligence, and satisfaction with worldly success rather than the worried piety that characterized medieval portraits. Renaissance subjects looked like people who enjoyed their lives and were proud of their achievements, a radical departure from medieval assumptions that visible happiness indicated spiritual complacency. Women's portraits underwent particularly dramatic transformation. Instead of the modest, withdrawn expressions required by medieval standards, Renaissance women could be shown with intelligence, beauty, and even hints of sensuality that emphasized their humanity rather than their conformity to religious ideals. Portraits like Leonardo's Lady with an Ermine showed women as complex individuals with their own thoughts and personalities, rather than as representatives of idealized feminine virtue. The new system also encouraged artistic innovation and experimentation in ways that medieval portrait culture had discouraged. Artists were free to explore new techniques for capturing personality, emotion, and psychological states, leading to developments in perspective, lighting, and composition that made Renaissance portraits far more sophisticated and compelling than their medieval predecessors. However, the new reality wasn't without its problems. The emphasis on individual expression and personality made portrait painting more difficult and unpredictable than the medieval system of standardized approaches. Artists had to develop new skills in psychology and human observation, while patrons had to trust artists' judgment about how they should be portrayed rather than relying on established formulas for appropriate appearance. Who won and who lost? In this transition reveals interesting patterns about Renaissance society. Successful merchants and bankers clearly benefited from a system that celebrated worldly achievement rather than noble birth. artists gained professional respect and creative freedom that transformed their social status from craftsmen to intellectual professionals. The church and traditional nobility lost some of their authority over cultural expression, though they remained important patrons who adapted to rather than abandon the new approaches. The new rules and norms emphasized authenticity, individuality, and artistic excellence rather than social conformity and theological compliance. Portraits were expected to capture something essential about their subjects' personalities and achievements, rather than simply demonstrating their adherence to appropriate social and religious standards. This created opportunities for more meaningful artistic expression, but also raised the stakes for both artists and patrons, who now had to succeed in a more competitive and less predictable environment. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically illustrates both the continuity and revolution in Renaissance culture. Portraits still served political, social, and family functions, and wealthy patrons still used them to project power and status. But the methods for achieving these goals shifted from conformity and restraint to individual expression and confident display of success and sophistication. The technical aspects of painting improved dramatically, with Renaissance artists developing far more sophisticated approaches to anatomy, perspective, and realistic representation than their medieval predecessors. But the social and psychological aspects of portraiture became more complex as artists and patrons had to navigate individual preferences and personalities rather than following established templates for appropriate appearance. Was this change positive or negative for European art and society? The answer depends largely on your perspective and what you value most in artistic and cultural expression. From an artistic standpoint, the Renaissance transformation was clearly beneficial. Renaissance portraits are technically superior to medieval ones in almost every measurable way: more realistic, more psychologically complex, more emotionally engaging, and more individually distinctive. The freedom to experiment with expression and technique led to innovations that advanced European art for centuries and created some of the most beloved artworks in human history. Different perspectives emerged when considering the social and cultural implications. Renaissance portrait culture celebrated individual achievement and personal success in ways that could be seen as either liberating or dangerous, depending on your views about the proper relationship between individual ambition and social stability. Medieval authorities who worried that the new style would encourage pride, vanity, and social disruption weren't entirely wrong. Renaissance culture did contribute to increasing individualism and challenges to traditional authority. Short-term versus long-term effects reveal interesting contradictions. In the short term, the Renaissance approach created more anxiety and uncertainty for both artists and patrons who had to navigate less predictable expectations and standards. Medieval portrait culture, for all its problems, at least provided clear guidelines that everyone understood. Renaissance culture required more creativity, risk-taking, and individual judgment, which could be stressful for people who preferred established routines. Long-term effects were overwhelmingly positive for artistic development and human expression. The Renaissance approach to portraiture established principles of individual dignity, artistic freedom, and psychological complexity that continue to influence art today. The celebration of human achievement and personality laid groundwork for later developments in democratic culture and individual rights. Unintended consequences included the gradual erosion of medieval social hierarchies and religious authority that had provided stability and order for centuries. While most people today would consider these changes beneficial, they created genuine challenges for societies that had to develop new sources of authority and social organization to replace traditional systems. Modern judgment tends to favor the Renaissance approach, but contemporary views were more mixed, with many people appreciating the new artistic possibilities while worrying about their social and spiritual implications. In the decades that followed the Renaissance portrait revolution, European art entered a period of rapid evolution and unexpected complications that nobody had quite anticipated. What started as a liberation from medieval constraints quickly developed into new forms of artistic pressure and social competition that were sometimes just as stressful as the old system, albeit in completely different ways. The most immediate consequence was what art historians call expression inflation, the tendency for portrait subjects to demand increasingly dramatic and distinctive facial expressions as the novelty of Renaissance naturalism wore off. If everyone could now smile in their portraits, then wealthy patrons wanted smiles that were more enigmatic, more confident, or more intellectually sophisticated than their competitors' smiles. The result was an arms race of facial expression that put new pressures on artists to constantly innovate and find fresh approaches to human emotion. This evolution created unexpected challenges for artists who had mastered Renaissance techniques but now found themselves competing in an increasingly crowded market where technical skill alone wasn't enough to guarantee success. Patrons began demanding not just realistic representation but also psychological insight, artistic innovation, and what we might call portrait charisma, the ability to make subjects look not just accurate but also compelling and memorable. The new competitive environment also changed the economics of portrait painting in ways that affected both established masters and emerging artists. While the most successful Renaissance artists could command enormous fees for their innovative approaches, the increased number of skilled painters meant that average artists faced more competition and pressure to reduce prices or develop specialized niches to survive in the market. Perhaps most interestingly, the success of Renaissance portrait techniques created a backlash among some conservative patrons who began commissioning deliberately traditional-style portraits as a form of cultural resistance. These neo-medieval portraits were painted with Renaissance technical skills, but adopted the serious, restrained expressions of earlier periods as a way of asserting traditional values and distinguishing their owners from what they saw as the frivolous individualism of mainstream Renaissance culture. The geographical spread of Renaissance techniques also created interesting regional variations as different European cultures adapted the new approaches to their own social and political contexts. Italian innovations worked well in Italian city-states, but required modification to succeed in French courts, German merchant cities, or English noble households, each of which had their own expectations about appropriate behavior and self-presentation. Second-generation effects included the emergence of new categories of art, criticism and connoisseurship, as wealthy patrons became more sophisticated about evaluating artistic quality and innovation. This created opportunities for art experts, dealers, and critics who could help patrons navigate the increasingly complex world of portrait commissioning. But it also added new layers of anxiety and competition to what had once been a relatively straightforward process. The Renaissance portrait revolution attracted a fascinating new cast of characters who transformed the medieval art world into something resembling a modern creative industry. These weren't just painters and patrons, but an entire ecosystem of specialists, innovators, and entrepreneurs who saw opportunities in the changing artistic landscape. First among the new players were the art dealers and agents who emerged to connect artists with patrons across wider geographical areas. Figures like Giovanni Battista della Palla in Florence developed networks that could arrange commissions between Italian artists and Northern European patrons, creating the first international art market. These dealers understood both artistic trends and regional preferences, allowing them to advise patrons on which artists could deliver the specific types of innovation they wanted while ensuring the results would be appropriate for their local social contexts. The role of art critics and theorists became increasingly important as portrait painting grew more sophisticated and competitive. Writers like Leon Battista Alberti developed theoretical frameworks for understanding and evaluating artistic quality that gave patrons vocabulary for discussing what they wanted and artists guidance for improving their techniques. These critics served as intermediaries between the technical aspects of artistic creation and the social functions of portrait ownership. Perhaps most interesting were the emergence of what we might call expression coaches, specialists who worked with portrait subjects to help them develop and maintain appropriate facial expressions during long painting sessions. Unlike the medieval theological consultants who focused on spiritual propriety, these Renaissance coaches concentrated on helping subjects project the specific personality traits and emotional states they wanted to communicate. Some wealthy families employed these coaches for weeks before portrait sessions, practicing expressions that would convey intelligence, confidence, sensuality, or other desired characteristics. The growing sophistication of Renaissance portrait techniques also created opportunities for forgers and copiers who could reproduce popular styles for patrons who couldn't afford original works by famous masters. This secondary market created its own cast of characters, including skilled copyists who specialized in particular artists' techniques and dealers who operated in the gray area between legitimate reproduction and outright fraud. New types of artists emerged who specialized in specific aspects of portrait painting rather than trying to master all elements of the craft. Some focused exclusively on painting hands. Others became experts in fabric and jewelry, and still others specialized in backgrounds and architectural elements. This specialization allowed for higher quality results, but also required more coordination and collaboration than medieval portrait painting had typically involved. The international nature of Renaissance art also attracted cultural translators who helped artists and patrons navigate the differences between regional artistic traditions and social expectations. These specialists understood how Italian Renaissance techniques needed to be modified for Flemish patrons, or how Northern European innovations could be adapted for Italian tastes, making them essential intermediaries in the growing international art trade. Female artists like Sofonisba Anguissola gained unprecedented recognition and success during this period, not just as novelties, but as serious professionals whose work was sought after by important patrons. Their success created new role models and opportunities for women in the art world, though they still faced significant barriers and discrimination that male artists didn't encounter. The emergence of art academies and formal training institutions created another new category of players, the art educators, who developed systematic approaches to teaching Renaissance techniques and theories. These institutions standardized artistic education in ways that made high-quality training more widely available while also creating new hierarchies and certification systems within the art world. But some problems persisted despite the Renaissance revolution, proving that changing artistic techniques couldn't solve all the underlying tensions between individual expression and social expectations. In fact, the new freedoms sometimes created more complex versions of old problems rather than eliminating them entirely. The fundamental issue of balancing authentic personality with social appropriateness remained challenging, just with different parameters than the medieval period. Renaissance patrons still needed their portraits to project authority, respectability, and proper values, but now they also wanted to appear sophisticated, individualistic, and artistically progressive. Threading this needle required even more skill and judgment than medieval portrait painting had demanded. What didn't get resolved was the basic conflict between artistic vision and patron control. Renaissance artists had gained more creative freedom, but they still depended on wealthy patrons for commissions, and those patrons still had strong opinions about how they wanted to be portrayed. The result was often elaborate negotiations about artistic decisions that could be just as contentious as medieval disputes about theological appropriateness. New versions of old problems emerged around the issue of artistic authenticity versus market demands. As Renaissance portrait techniques became more popular and profitable, artists faced pressure to develop signature styles that would distinguish their work from competitors. This led to situations where artistic innovation was driven more by marketing considerations than by genuine creative inspiration, creating a commercialization of art that some critics found troubling. The democratization of sophisticated portrait techniques also created new forms of social competition and anxiety. When only nobles could afford high-quality portraits, the social implications were relatively clear. But when wealthy merchants could commission Renaissance masterpieces, the portrait world became a more complex arena for status competition, where traditional hierarchies were challenged by artistic and economic considerations. Cyclical patterns developed around artistic innovation and conservative reaction. Periods of rapid change in portrait styles were often followed by movements toward more traditional approaches as patrons and artists sought stability and familiarity. These cycles created confusion about artistic standards and made it difficult for artists to predict what approaches would be successful. Why certain issues proved intractable reveals fundamental tensions in Renaissance society between innovation and tradition, individual expression and social order, artistic freedom, and economic necessity. The Renaissance celebration of individual achievement conflicted with continued needs for social hierarchy and collective stability, creating contradictions that couldn't be resolved through artistic techniques alone. The international spread of Renaissance techniques also created ongoing issues around cultural appropriateness and artistic authenticity. Techniques developed for Italian city-state culture didn't always translate well to Northern European contexts, leading to artistic results that sometimes looked forced or artificial when artists tried to apply foreign approaches to local subjects and social contexts. Technical innovations also created new problems around artistic preservation and reproduction. Renaissance portraits were more complex and sophisticated than medieval ones, but they were also more vulnerable to damage and more difficult to restore. The use of new pigments and techniques sometimes led to deterioration problems that weren't apparent until decades after the portraits were completed. The growing art market also created ongoing issues around artistic fraud and misattribution. As Renaissance masters gained fame and their works became valuable, the incentive for forgery and false attribution increased, creating problems for collectors and creating distortions in the art market that affected both artists and patrons. Compared to earlier medieval portraits, Renaissance developments represented a fundamental shift in how European society understood the relationship between individual identity and artistic representation. While medieval portraits had treated individual personality as something to be subordinated to social and spiritual roles, Renaissance culture celebrated personal distinctiveness as a valuable and legitimate subject for artistic exploration. What was unique about the Renaissance approach was its combination of technical sophistication with psychological complexity. Earlier artistic traditions had sometimes achieved one or the other, but Renaissance portraits were the first to consistently deliver both realistic representation and compelling emotional expression. This combination created a new standard for artistic achievement that influenced European art for centuries. What was universal about Renaissance portrait innovations was their appeal to human desires for recognition, respect, and immortality through artistic representation. Regardless of cultural context, people wanted portraits that captured their best qualities and preserved them for posterity. Renaissance techniques were successful across different regions and social classes because they offered better tools for achieving these universal goals. Lessons that could be learned from Renaissance portrait evolution include the importance of balancing artistic freedom with social responsibility, the value of technical innovation combined with psychological insight, and the need for flexible approaches that could adapt to different cultural contexts while maintaining artistic integrity. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the tendency for artistic innovations to create both liberation and new forms of anxiety, the importance of economic factors in driving artistic change, and the recurring tension between individual expression and collective social needs. These patterns appeared not just in portrait painting, but in other forms of Renaissance art and culture. The Renaissance experience also demonstrated how artistic change could both reflect and drive broader social transformations. The shift toward more individualistic portrait styles both responded to and encouraged growing emphasis on personal achievement and individual rights that would eventually contribute to modern democratic culture. Comparing Renaissance portrait culture to modern approaches reveals interesting continuities and differences. Like contemporary portrait photography and social media self-presentation, Renaissance portraits served as tools for identity construction and social communication. But Renaissance culture placed much greater emphasis on permanent artistic quality and lasting cultural significance than modern approaches that often prioritize immediate impact and broad distribution. The Renaissance also showed how artistic innovation could serve as a form of social and political change, challenging established hierarchies and power structures through new forms of representation and expression. This demonstrated the potential for art to function as both cultural reflection and cultural catalyst, influencing social development rather than simply responding to it. Perhaps most importantly, the Renaissance portrait revolution illustrated how technical artistic innovation and social change could reinforce each other, creating periods of rapid cultural transformation that redefined fundamental assumptions about human nature, social organization, and the proper goals of artistic creation. By the early 16th century, the writing was on the wall for medieval portrait conventions, though some die-hard traditionalists refused to read it. The signs pointing to the complete transformation of European portrait culture were everywhere, in the art markets, in patron preferences, in artistic training, and most tellingly, in the desperate attempts of medieval-style consultants to remain relevant in a world that was rapidly moving beyond their expertise. The most obvious warning sign was the economic collapse of traditional portrait consulting services. Master Geoffrey de Clare, who had once commanded enormous fees for his facial expression charts and theological expertise, found himself struggling to find clients willing to pay for services that Renaissance artists increasingly considered unnecessary. Interference. His elaborate theories about physiognomical theology looked increasingly ridiculous compared to the psychological sophistication that Renaissance masters brought to their work. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the different levels of awareness about the magnitude of change taking place. Progressive artists and patrons understood that they were participating in a fundamental transformation of European culture, while conservative authorities often convinced themselves that Renaissance innovations were temporary fashions that would eventually give way to renewed appreciation for traditional approaches. Church officials, who had once wielded significant influence over artistic expression, found their authority steadily eroding as secular patrons gained confidence in making their own artistic decisions. The Catholic Church's response was often to double down on traditional requirements for religious art, while gradually accepting that they had less control over secular portraits than they had enjoyed during the medieval period. The resistance to inevitable change took various forms, from nostalgic attempts to revive medieval styles to angry denunciations of Renaissance, decadence, and spiritual corruption. Some conservative noble families made deliberate efforts to commission traditional style portraits as political statements about their commitment to established values and their rejection of what they saw as dangerous innovations. Perhaps most telling was the generational divide that emerged within wealthy families, where older members often preferred traditional portrait approaches, while younger family members insisted on Renaissance styles. These internal family conflicts over artistic choices reflected broader tensions between medieval and Renaissance worldviews that were reshaping European society. The training of new artists provided another clear indicator of change. Art workshops and emerging academies were focusing almost exclusively on Renaissance techniques and theories, meaning that young artists were learning approaches that made medieval portrait conventions seem outdated and primitive. The knowledge and skills needed to create traditional medieval portraits were gradually disappearing as older master craftsmen retired or died without passing on their specialized expertise. Market forces also signaled the end of the medieval system. Traditional style portraits were becoming harder to sell and less prestigious to own, while Renaissance works commanded higher prices and greater social cachet. Even conservative patrons who preferred traditional approaches often found themselves commissioning Renaissance-style portraits, because that's what conveyed appropriate wealth and sophistication in the changing cultural landscape. The international spread of Renaissance techniques meant that medieval approaches were becoming provincially embarrassing rather than traditionally respectable. Wealthy families who wanted to maintain connections with broader European culture needed portraits that demonstrated their awareness of current artistic developments rather than their attachment to outdated conventions. The final death blow to medieval portrait conventions came not through dramatic confrontation, but through a series of symbolic moments and practical developments that made the old system simply irrelevant rather than actively defeated. The most symbolic of these moments occurred in 1520 when Pope Leo X, the ultimate representative of church authority, commissioned Raphael to paint his portrait in full Renaissance style, complete with a subtle but unmistakable expression of papal confidence and worldly sophistication. Leo X's portrait session became legendary in art circles for its complete abandonment of medieval portrait protocols. Instead of the worried piety and humble deference that medieval papal portraits had required, Leo appeared relaxed, intelligent, and clearly enjoying both his spiritual authority and his temporal power. When church critics complained that the portrait showed insufficient attention to spiritual humility, Leo reportedly responded that God gave us the papacy, so let us enjoy it, a statement that would have been unthinkable from a medieval pope, and represented the complete triumph of Renaissance attitudes over medieval constraints. The specific events that marked the system's end varied by region and social class, but the pattern was remarkably consistent across Europe. In Florence, the last traditional portrait consultant closed his practice in 1518, when he could no longer find clients willing to pay for medieval-style expression coaching. In Paris, the French court officially abandoned requirements for church approval of secular portraits in 1522, marking the end of theological oversight of artistic expression. The final major players in the medieval system went out not with a bang, but with a whimper. Brother Benedict of Cluny, the monk who had built his reputation as a critic of spiritually inappropriate art, spent his final years writing increasingly desperate treatises about the spiritual dangers of Renaissance portrait techniques that nobody read and even fewer people took seriously. His death in 1525 marked the end of systematic church criticism of secular portrait expression. Meanwhile, traditional artists who had specialized in medieval-style portraits found themselves either adapting to Renaissance techniques or leaving the profession entirely. Master Willem of Bruges, who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of painting appropriately humble, noble expressions, attempted to learn Renaissance approaches in his 60s, but found himself unable to compete with younger artists who had grown up with the new techniques. His final commission, completed in 1519, was described by contemporaries as medieval dignity painted with Renaissance skill, a combination that satisfied nobody and pleased no one. Last attempts to preserve traditional approaches often took the form of academic treatises and theoretical defenses rather than actual artistic commissions. Several conservative scholars wrote lengthy books defending medieval portrait principles and warning about the spiritual dangers of Renaissance innovations. But these works were largely ignored by both artists and patrons who had moved on to more contemporary concerns. The dramatic final moments of medieval portrait culture were often more pathetic than heroic. Geoffrey de Clare's last recorded appearance was at a 1521 conference where he attempted to demonstrate his expression charts to an audience of Renaissance artists who listened politely but clearly considered his presentation an amusing historical curiosity rather than useful professional development. The gradual decline versus sudden collapse pattern meant that medieval portrait conventions died slowly rather than dramatically, becoming increasingly irrelevant and ridiculous until they simply disappeared from active practice. By 1525, commissioning a traditional medieval-style portrait was like insisting on traveling by ox cart when horses were available. Technically possible, but socially embarrassing and practically pointless. Symbolic endpoints included the conversion of the last major portrait workshops from medieval to Renaissance techniques, the final graduation classes from art programs that still taught traditional approaches, and the death of the last generation of master craftsmen who remembered how medieval portraits were supposed to work. Perhaps most symbolically, several prominent families that had commissioned traditional portraits during the 1510s had them repainted in Renaissance style during the 1520s, literally erasing the visual record of their previous commitment to medieval approaches. The collapse of medieval portrait conventions resulted from a perfect storm of cultural, economic, and technological factors that made the old system not just obsolete, but actively counterproductive for achieving the goals the portraits were supposed to serve. The primary internal problem was that medieval portrait requirements had become so complex and contradictory that they were nearly impossible to satisfy successfully. The elaborate system of theological, social, and political considerations that governed facial expressions had evolved into a bureaucratic nightmare that frustrated artists and patrons while producing results that looked forced and artificial, rather than dignified and appropriate. External pressures came from the broader transformation of European society that was undermining the feudal structures and religious authority on which medieval portrait culture depended. The rise of merchant wealth, the growth of cities, the development of international trade, and the intellectual changes associated with Renaissance humanism all created demands for artistic expression that medieval portrait conventions simply couldn't accommodate. The role of individual visionaries versus historical forces created an interesting dynamic where specific artists and patrons accelerated changes that were probably inevitable, given broader social and cultural developments. Leonardo da Vinci's innovations might have happened earlier or later, but the social and economic pressures that made Renaissance portrait approaches more practical and appealing than medieval alternatives would have eventually produced similar results, regardless of individual contributions. What could have been done differently reveals the fundamental incompatibility between medieval social structures and Renaissance cultural aspirations. Medieval portrait conventions might have survived longer if church and noble authorities had been more flexible about adapting their requirements to changing social conditions. But such flexibility would have required abandoning the very principles that made medieval culture distinctive and coherent. The question of inevitability versus contingency is particularly interesting because medieval Portrait culture was already showing signs of internal strain and contradiction long before Renaissance. Alternatives became available. The Van der Meer disaster and similar conflicts demonstrated that the medieval system was becoming unsustainable even on its own terms, suggesting that some form of transformation was probably inevitable regardless of Renaissance innovations. Economic factors played a crucial role in the system's collapse. Medieval portrait approaches required expensive consultations, lengthy negotiations, and complex approval processes that made them more costly and time-consuming than Renaissance alternatives. As Renaissance techniques became more widely available and less expensive, the medieval system became economically uncompetitive as well as artistically outdated. The international dimension was equally important. Medieval portrait conventions had developed within relatively isolated regional contexts, but Renaissance culture operated on a European and eventually global scale. Families and institutions that wanted to participate in international networks needed artistic approaches that would be understood and respected across cultural boundaries, making medieval regional traditions seem provincial and limiting. Technological and artistic developments also contributed to the medieval system's obsolescence. Renaissance innovations in perspective, anatomy, and realistic representation made medieval approaches look technically primitive, while new understandings of psychology and human expression made medieval emotional restraint seem artificial and unconvincing. Perhaps most fundamentally, medieval portrait culture ended because it represented a worldview that was being replaced by fundamentally different assumptions about human nature, social organization, and the proper goals of artistic expression. The medieval emphasis on collective identity, social hierarchy, and spiritual submission was giving way to Renaissance celebration of individual achievement, personal expression, and worldly success, changes that required new forms of artistic representation that medieval conventions simply couldn't provide. The immediate aftermath of medieval portrait culture's collapse was characterized by both liberation and confusion as artists, patrons, and cultural institutions struggled to navigate a world where the old rules no longer applied, but new standards were still being developed. Who stepped into the vacuum left by medieval authorities reveals the decentralized nature of Renaissance culture. Instead of unified church or noble control over artistic expression, authority was distributed among individual artists, wealthy patrons, art critics, and theorists, and market forces that rewarded innovation and quality rather than conformity. To establish standards, this decentralization created more freedom, but also more uncertainty about artistic standards and social appropriateness. The short-term consequences included a period of rapid experimentation and innovation as artists explored the possibilities of Renaissance techniques without medieval constraints. This creative explosion produced some of the greatest masterpieces in European art history, but it also created confusion about artistic standards and led to some spectacular failures as artists and patrons tried approaches that didn't work. Contemporary reactions were mixed, reflecting the broader cultural tensions between medieval and Renaissance worldviews. Progressive patrons and artists celebrated their liberation from artificial constraints and the opportunity to create more authentic and compelling art. Conservative observers worried about the spiritual and social implications of artistic approaches that seemed to encourage pride, vanity, and individualistic self-assertion. Attempts at revival or continuation of medieval approaches were generally unsuccessful, though they persisted in some regions and contexts longer than others. Religious art retained more traditional elements than secular portraits, and some conservative noble families continued commissioning traditional style portraits as political statements about their values and allegiances. The immediate legacy also included the emergence of new artistic institutions and practices that replaced medieval structures. Art academies, dealer networks, critical publications, and international markets all developed to serve the needs of Renaissance artistic culture, creating a more sophisticated and professionalized art world than had existed during the medieval period. The economic impact was significant and mostly positive for artists who could master Renaissance techniques. The new system created more opportunities for artistic success and recognition, while also increasing competition and raising standards for professional achievement. Patrons generally benefited from having access to higher quality and more personally meaningful artistic works, though they also faced new challenges in navigating a more complex and less regulated art market. Perhaps most importantly, the immediate aftermath established Renaissance artistic principles as the new European standard, creating expectations and standards that would influence artistic development for centuries. The emphasis on individual expression, technical excellence, and psychological complexity became fundamental assumptions about what art should achieve, replacing medieval priorities of social conformity and spiritual propriety. The transition also created new forms of cultural prestige and social competition based on artistic sophistication rather than traditional authority, contributing to broader changes in European society that emphasize merit, innovation, and individual achievement over inherited status and collective conformity. The legacy of medieval portrait culture shaped European artistic development in ways that extended far beyond the immediate Renaissance period, creating patterns and expectations that influenced artistic expression for centuries and established fundamental assumptions about the relationship between individual identity and visual representation that persists today. The most significant long-term influence was the establishment of portraiture as a legitimate and important artistic genre, worthy of serious attention from major artists. Medieval portrait culture, despite its constraints, proved that there was enormous demand for artistic works that captured individual identity and social status, creating market conditions that supported the development of increasingly sophisticated artistic techniques and approaches. How later generations viewed medieval portraits reveals changing cultural attitudes about the relationship between artistic expression and social conformity. Renaissance viewers saw medieval portraits as quaint examples of primitive artistic techniques constrained by religious superstition. Enlightenment critics viewed them as evidence of the oppressive nature of medieval social and religious authority. Romantic era observers found them appealingly mysterious and spiritually profound. Modern art historians appreciate them as sophisticated expressions of complex cultural values that deserve understanding on their own terms. The myths versus realities that developed around medieval portrait culture illustrate how historical memory can be shaped by later cultural needs and assumptions. The popular image of medieval people as perpetually grim and joyless was partly created by overemphasizing the serious expressions in medieval portraits while ignoring the cultural and practical reasons for those expressions. This mythologization served later periods needs to see themselves as more enlightened and liberated than their predecessors. Why medieval portrait culture remained important in later periods had less to do with aesthetic appreciation than with its value as a cultural reference point for discussions about artistic freedom, social conformity, and the proper relationship between individual expression and collective values. The medieval period became a useful symbol of artistic oppression that later movements could define themselves against. The influence on artistic education was particularly significant. Renaissance art academies used medieval portraits as examples of what not to do, teaching students to avoid the stiffness, artificiality, and emotional restraint that characterized traditional approaches. This negative pedagogy helped establish principles of naturalism, psychological complexity, and individual expression that became fundamental to European artistic training. Medieval portrait conventions also influenced the development of artistic criticism and theory. Renaissance and later writers used medieval examples to develop arguments about artistic quality, cultural progress, and the social functions of art. The contrast between medieval constraints and Renaissance freedom became a standard narrative framework for understanding artistic development that influenced how Europeans thought about cultural change. More generally, the international spread of European artistic influence meant that medieval portrait conventions indirectly affected artistic development in other cultures as European approaches to portraiture were adopted, adapted, or rejected by non-European societies. The medieval emphasis on social hierarchy and collective identity versus the Renaissance celebration of individualism became part of broader cultural exchanges between European and non-European artistic traditions. Perhaps most importantly, medieval portrait culture established the idea that artistic expression could and should serve political, social, and spiritual functions beyond mere decoration or entertainment. This understanding of art as a form of cultural communication with serious social consequences influenced later developments in propaganda, advertising, and mass media that continue to shape how visual images function in contemporary society. The preservation of medieval portraits in museums and private collections also created opportunities for later generations to study and appreciate artistic approaches that might otherwise have been completely forgotten, contributing to more nuanced understanding of medieval culture and artistic achievement that challenged simplistic narratives about cultural progress and artistic development. Today, we can see echoes of medieval portrait anxiety in our contemporary social media culture, where the pressure to present an appropriate public image through carefully curated photographs creates surprisingly similar tensions between authentic self-expression and social conformity. The medieval concern with facial expressions that conveyed proper spiritual and social values has evolved into modern worries about posting photos that project appropriate professional competence, personal happiness, and social awareness. The medieval practice of hiring expression consultants finds its modern equivalent in the growing industry of social media coaches, personal branding experts, and image consultants who help individuals craft online personas that will enhance their career prospects and social standing. Like their medieval predecessors, these modern consultants must navigate the complex requirements of different audiences, professional networks, family connections, and social groups, each of which has different expectations about appropriate self-presentation. Medieval families' anxiety about commissioning portraits that would represent them appropriately for generations parallels contemporary concerns about digital permanence and the long-term consequences of online image choices. Just as medieval patrons worried that inappropriate facial expressions might damage their family's reputation for centuries, modern individuals struggle with the knowledge that social media posts and professional photos may follow them indefinitely and influence how they're perceived by future employers, romantic partners, and social connections. The medieval tension between individual personality and social expectations appears in contemporary debates about authenticity versus strategic self-presentation on social media platforms. Modern users face pressure to be genuine and spontaneous while also maintaining appropriate professional and social images, creating the same kind of psychological stress that medieval portrait subjects experienced when trying to look both authentic and socially appropriate. What hasn't changed about human nature is the fundamental desire for recognition, respect, and positive social regard that drove medieval portrait culture and continues to motivate contemporary image-making behaviors. People still want to be seen as successful, attractive, intelligent, and morally admirable, and they still struggle with balancing these desires against social expectations and cultural constraints. Similar patterns in different contexts appear in contemporary corporate headshot culture, where business professionals must project competence and approachability while avoiding expressions that might seem unprofessional, threatening, or inappropriate for their industry. The rules governing appropriate expressions in business photography often echo medieval concerns about conveying proper authority, while showing suitable deference to hierarchy and social expectations. The medieval church's role in regulating artistic expression finds modern parallels in social media platform policies, workplace image guidelines, and cultural movements that police appropriate representation and expression. Contemporary discussions about cultural sensitivity, professional appropriateness, and social responsibility in image-making echo medieval debates about spiritual propriety and social conformity in artistic representation. Political portrait photography continues to reflect medieval concerns about projecting appropriate authority while appealing to different constituencies. Modern political figures must navigate similar challenges to medieval nobles in presenting images that convey leadership capability while remaining relatable to ordinary voters, requiring the same kind of careful calibration of facial expressions and symbolic elements that characterize medieval political portraiture. The democratization of portrait photography through smartphone technology has created situations similar to the late medieval period, when wealthy merchants could afford high-quality portraits, challenging traditional social hierarchies and creating new forms of status competition based on image quality and artistic sophistication rather than inherited position. Dating app profile pictures represent perhaps the closest modern equivalent to medieval portrait anxiety, where individuals must compress their entire personality and social value into a single, carefully chosen image that will determine their romantic prospects. The pressure to look attractive, successful, and emotionally available while avoiding expressions that might seem desperate, arrogant, or inappropriate creates the same kind of impossible balancing act that medieval portrait subjects faced. Contemporary discussions about representation, diversity, and inclusion in media and advertising echo medieval debates about who deserved to be portrayed in art and how different social groups should be represented. The medieval concern with maintaining social hierarchy through artistic representation continues in modern discussions about whose images are featured prominently in advertising, entertainment, and professional contexts. Even now, medieval portrait culture influences contemporary academic study, popular culture, political discourse, and social movements in ways that reveal the enduring relevance of medieval concerns about image, identity, and social representation. Academic study of medieval portraits continues to provide insights into historical social structures, religious beliefs, and cultural values that help historians understand how medieval societies functioned and how they differed from contemporary assumptions about human nature and social organization. Art historians use medieval portraits to trace the development of artistic techniques, cultural exchange between regions, and the evolution of ideas about individual identity and social hierarchy. Popular culture frequently references medieval portrait conventions as shorthand for depicting historical periods, social formality, or cultural constraint. Movies, television shows, and literature use medieval-style serious expressions to signal historical authenticity or to contrast medieval social restrictions with modern freedom and spontaneity. This popular usage helps maintain public awareness of medieval artistic conventions while often oversimplifying their cultural significance. Political discourse continues to invoke medieval examples when discussing the relationship between artistic freedom and social responsibility. Contemporary debates about censorship, cultural appropriation, and appropriate representation often reference medieval precedents as examples of either oppressive cultural control or beneficial social guidance, depending on the political perspective of the speaker. Social movements focused on representation and inclusion frequently cite medieval portrait culture as an example of how artistic conventions can reinforce social hierarchies and exclude marginalized groups from cultural visibility. These movements use medieval examples to argue for more diverse and inclusive approaches to contemporary image-making that avoid reproducing historical patterns of exclusion and marginalization. Why people still care about medieval portraits extends beyond historical curiosity to contemporary concerns about authenticity, social pressure, and the relationship between individual expression and collective values. Medieval portrait culture provides a historical perspective on ongoing human struggles with self-presentation, social conformity, and the desire for recognition and respect that remain relevant to contemporary experience. The continued study and display of medieval portraits in museums and educational institutions helps maintain public awareness of historical artistic achievement while providing opportunities for reflection on how cultural values and artistic approaches have changed over time, contributing to broader understanding of cultural development and historical change. Looking back across our journey through the world of medieval portraits, we've discovered that the reason medieval people didn't smile in their paintings had nothing to do with dental hygiene, constant misery, or an inability to experience joy. Instead, we've uncovered a fascinating world where every facial expression carried complex social, political, and spiritual meaning in ways that made a simple smile as politically dangerous as a modern scandal and as spiritually questionable as a medieval heresy. The key patterns that emerged throughout our exploration reveal the fundamental human tension between individual expression and social conformity that transcends any particular historical period. Medieval people weren't fundamentally different from us. They wanted recognition, respect, and the chance to present themselves positively to the world. But they lived in a society where the rules for appropriate self-presentation were far more complex and restrictive than anything we face today. Most surprising discoveries included the realization that medieval portrait culture was incredibly sophisticated in its understanding of psychology, social dynamics, and visual communication. The elaborate system of consultants, critics, and advisors that developed around portrait painting reveals a society that took image management just as seriously as any modern corporation or political campaign, albeit with very different priorities and constraints. The most important takeaways center around understanding how cultural context shapes artistic expression and how artistic conventions both reflect and reinforce social values. Medieval portraits weren't primitive attempts at realistic representation. They were sophisticated tools for navigating complex social hierarchies and spiritual requirements that served important functions within their cultural context. How our understanding has evolved throughout this journey illustrates the danger of judging historical cultures by contemporary standards without understanding their own internal logic and values. What initially appeared to be evidence of medieval grimness and repression revealed itself to be a complex system for managing social relationships and spiritual concerns that had its own internal consistency and practical effectiveness. The human elements that emerged from Vandermeer's artistic integrity to the Earl of Warwick's social anxiety to Marguerite Law Painter's innovative solutions for painting women remind us that behind every historical system were real people struggling with universal human concerns about recognition, respect, and authentic self-expression within the constraints of their particular cultural moment. Perhaps most fascinatingly, we've seen how the medieval system contained the seeds of its own transformation. The very success of medieval portrait culture in creating demand for sophisticated artistic representation eventually led to innovations that made medieval constraints seem artificial and unnecessary. This pattern of cultural systems evolving beyond their original parameters appears throughout history and continues to shape contemporary cultural development. The international dimension revealed how local cultural innovations can spread and transform entire civilizations when they address universal human needs more effectively than existing alternatives. The Renaissance portrait revolution succeeded, not just because it was technically superior to medieval approaches, but because it offered better solutions for universal human desires for recognition, self-expression, and social communication. Our final story comes from 1543, when an elderly Flemish artist named Master Peter van Houten received what would be the last commission for a deliberately medieval-style portrait in the records of the Brussels Guild system. The client was Lady Margaret de Clermont, a 70-year-old French noblewoman who had decided that she wanted her final portrait to honor the artistic traditions of her youth rather than follow contemporary Renaissance fashions. Lady Margaret's request created a fascinating challenge for Van Houten, who had spent the previous 20 years learning Renaissance techniques and had almost forgotten how to paint in the traditional medieval style. He had to consult historical examples, study old guild manuals, and even track down one of Geoffrey de Clare's surviving expression charts to remember how medieval portraits were supposed to work. The resulting painting session became a meditation on cultural change and personal memory. Lady Margaret spent hours practicing the serious, pious expression she remembered from portraits of her grandmother, while Van Houten struggled to suppress his instincts toward Renaissance naturalism and psychological complexity. Both artist and subject found themselves performing historical roles that felt simultaneously familiar and strange, like actors in a play about their own past. What makes this story particularly poignant is Van Houten's journal account of the experience. He wrote that painting Lady Margaret's deliberately archaic portrait made him realize how much European culture had changed during his lifetime. I felt like a scribe who had learned to use a printing press being asked to illuminate a manuscript by hand, he noted. The old techniques came back to me, but they felt like memories of a different world. Lady Margaret's portrait, when completed, looked exactly like a medieval painting. Serious expression, symbolic elements, careful attention to spiritual propriety and social hierarchy. But contemporary viewers found it deeply moving in ways that original medieval portraits had never been, precisely because it represented a conscious choice to honor historical tradition rather than an unconscious following of contemporary convention. The portrait's impact reveals something profound about cultural memory and artistic meaning. When medieval artists painted serious expressions, they were following the natural conventions of their time. When Lady Margaret chose to be painted with a medieval expression in 1543, she was making a statement about values, memory, and relationship between past and present that gave the old artistic conventions entirely new meaning. Van Houten's final comment about the experience encapsulates the broader transformation we've explored. I realized that Lady Margaret and I were not really creating a medieval portrait at all. We were creating a Renaissance portrait of medieval values, which is an entirely different thing. The moment you choose to paint in an old style, rather than simply painting in the style of your time, you are already thinking like a Renaissance person rather than a medieval one. The portrait survived World War II bombing that destroyed much of the Brussels Guildhall, and it now hangs in a small museum in Belgium where visitors often comment on the subject's authentically medieval expression without realizing they're looking at a Renaissance-era recreation of medieval conventions. This misunderstanding somehow makes the portrait even more meaningful, as it demonstrates how our contemporary relationship with historical art is always filtered through layers of cultural change and reinterpretation that make simple historical categories more complex than they initially appear. As we come to the end of our exploration of medieval portrait culture, it's worth remembering that the serious faces looking out at us from medieval paintings were expressions of sadness or fear, but rather carefully constructed presentations of dignity, piety, and social awareness that served important functions within their cultural context. The next time you see a medieval portrait, perhaps you'll notice not the absence of smiles, but The presence of sophisticated cultural communication that reveals a society every bit as complex and psychologically nuanced as our own. Those serious expressions weren't evidence of medieval grimness, but rather proof of medieval sophistication in understanding how images function as social and spiritual documents. These medieval faces remind us that every culture develops its own ways of managing the eternal human challenge of presenting ourselves to the world in ways that honor both our individual dignity and our collective responsibilities. The medieval solution may seem strange to us now, but it worked for its time and place. Just as our contemporary approaches to image-making serve our own cultural needs and values, in the gentle darkness of evening, surrounded by the quiet hum of daily life, we can appreciate the medieval understanding that how we choose to present ourselves to the world, whether in painted portraits or digital photos, reflects not just our individual personalities, but our deeper beliefs about what it means to live with dignity and purpose within the communities that shape and sustain us. The story of medieval portraits ultimately teaches us that human nature remains constant, even as cultural expressions of that nature changed dramatically over time. Medieval people wanted the same things we want: recognition, respect, love, and the chance to be remembered positively after we're gone. They simply lived in a world with different rules about how to achieve those universal goals. Their serious expressions in portraits weren't evidence of an inability to experience joy, but rather proof of their sophisticated understanding that public images carry responsibilities as well as opportunities. In a world where your portrait might represent your family for generations and influence how your descendants were treated by society, getting your facial expression right was a matter of genuine importance that deserved serious attention and careful consideration. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval approach to portraits reminds us that there's value in taking the long view of how we present ourselves to the world. While contemporary culture often emphasizes immediate impact and instant gratification, medieval families understood that the images we create of ourselves become part of our lasting legacy and deserve the kind of thoughtful consideration that produces results we can be proud of for years or even centuries to come. As we navigate our own world of digital images and social media presentations, we might benefit from remembering the medieval wisdom that how we choose to show our faces to the world is never just about the present moment, but always about the kind of people we want to be and the kind of world we want to help create through our individual choices about dignity, authenticity, and responsibility to the communities that shape our lives. In this understanding, perhaps medieval portrait culture has something valuable to teach us about finding the balance between individual expression and collective responsibility that every generation must discover within the particular circumstances of their own time and place.